In the spring of 1820, a 14-year-old boy supposedly walked into a grove of trees in upstate New York and emerged with a story that would eventually launch one of the most successful religious movements in American history. Joseph Smith claimed he had seen God. Not just any vision, not a dream, not an impression. He claimed the heavens opened and divine beings appeared to him in broad daylight. For millions of members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, this event known as the First Vision is the foundation of everything. It establishes Joseph Smith's prophetic authority. It justifies the existence of a restored church. It explains why Mormonism rejects every other Christian denomination on earth. Without the First Vision, there is no Book of Mormon, no temples, no priesthood restoration, no eternal families. The entire theological structure depends on the authenticity of what happened in that grove. And that creates a significant problem. Because Joseph Smith told this story at least 4 different times. And the versions do not match. We are not talking about minor variations in peripheral details. We are talking about fundamental changes to the core elements of the experience. How many beings appeared? 1 or 2? Who were they? What did they say? Why did they appear? The answers to these questions shift dramatically depending on which account you read and when Joseph Smith wrote it. This documentary will examine all 4 major accounts of the First Vision. We will look at what Joseph Smith actually wrote, when he wrote it, and what was happening in his life at the time. We will consider the official explanations offered by the LDS Church and evaluate whether those explanations hold up under scrutiny. And we will ask a simple but uncomfortable question. If this vision was the most important religious event in modern history, why does the story keep changing? This is not an attack on anyone's faith. Millions of sincere, intelligent people believe in the restoration narrative. But faith built on incomplete information is not faith. It is manipulation. And everyone deserves the opportunity to examine the full historical record before deciding what to believe. So let us begin at the beginning. Not with the polished, official version taught in Sunday school and missionary discussions. Let us start with the account Joseph Smith himself wrote first. The 1832 account. The version that disappeared. In 1832, Joseph Smith sat down to write his personal history. The church he founded was 2 years old. He had translated and published the Book of Mormon. He had organized congregations, ordained leaders, and established himself as a prophet with divine authority. And for the first time in the written record, he decided to document the experience that supposedly started it all. This 1832 account is extraordinary for several reasons. It is the earliest written version of the First Vision. It is written in Joseph Smith's own hand. And it tells a story that is dramatically different from the one taught by the LDS Church today. In this version, Joseph describes being troubled by his sins. He writes about searching the scriptures and becoming convinced that the world had departed from the true gospel. He describes crying out to God for mercy and forgiveness. And then he describes what happened next. He saw one being, not 2. 1. Joseph identifies this being as the Lord. He does not distinguish between the Father and the Son. There is no mention of 2 separate personages. There is no dramatic scene where God the Father introduces Jesus Christ. There is simply the Lord appearing to a teenage boy seeking forgiveness for his sins. The message of this vision is also remarkably different from the official account. In 1832, the focus is entirely personal. Joseph is told that his sins are forgiven. He learns that Jesus Christ was crucified for the world and that those who believe in him will have eternal life. The vision is about personal salvation, personal redemption, personal forgiveness. What is missing from this account is just as significant as what is present. There is no mention of God the Father appearing as a separate being. There is no mention of being told that all churches are wrong. There is no mention of a universal apostasy that required a full restoration of the gospel. There is no prophetic calling, no indication that Joseph was chosen to do anything beyond receiving personal assurance of his own salvation. This is a conversion narrative. It is the kind of religious experience that thousands of people claimed during the Second Great Awakening that was sweeping through New York at the time. Joseph Smith's 1832 account fits perfectly within this cultural context. But here is what makes this account truly problematic for the LDS Church. It was hidden. For decades, This earliest version of the first vision was not taught, not published, not mentioned. Church members had no idea it existed. The manuscript was kept in church archives, inaccessible to ordinary members and even most scholars. It was not until the 1960s that researchers discovered this account and began asking difficult questions about why it differed so dramatically from the official narrative. Why would the church suppress the earliest account of its foundational event? If this was simply an incomplete telling of the same story, why not share it openly? Why not use it to demonstrate consistency across multiple accounts? The answer becomes clear when you compare what Joseph wrote in 1832 to what the church teaches today. The 1832 account does not support the theological claims that modern Mormonism requires. It does not establish that God the Father and Jesus Christ are separate beings with physical bodies. It does not establish that all other churches are apostate. It does not establish Joseph Smith's unique prophetic authority to restore the one true church. The 1832 account describes a personal religious experience. The official version describes a cosmic event that changes human history. These are not the same story told differently. These are different stories entirely. To understand what the 1832 account really represents, we need to understand the world Joseph Smith grew up in. The region of upstate New York where the Smith family lived was known as the Burned-Over District, a name that reflected how thoroughly it had been scorched by the fires of religious revival. This was ground zero for the Second Great Awakening, one of the most intense periods of religious fervor in American history. Between 1800 and 1840, wave after wave of evangelical revival swept through this region. Methodist circuit riders preached hellfire and salvation. Baptist preachers called sinners to repentance. Presbyterian ministers warned of coming judgment. Camp meetings drew thousands of people who would spend days praying, singing, weeping, and experiencing what they believed were direct encounters with the divine. And here is what matters for our investigation. Thousands of people claimed to have visions during this period. Thousands reported seeing Jesus. Thousands described experiences where they cried out in spiritual anguish, were overcome by divine power, and received personal assurance that their sins were forgiven. These experiences were so common that they became almost formulaic. Scholars have documented the standard elements of a Second Great Awakening conversion narrative: conviction of sin, spiritual despair, crying out to God, a vision or experience of divine presence, and the joy of knowing one's sins were forgiven. Read Joseph Smith's 1832 account with this context in mind, and something becomes immediately clear. His description of the first vision fits perfectly within this cultural template. A young man troubled by his sins. Spiritual confusion and searching. Crying out to God in desperation. Seeing the Lord. Receiving assurance of forgiveness. This is not a unique prophetic experience. This is a standard evangelical conversion narrative, virtually indistinguishable from thousands of others recorded during the same period. The 1832 account does not set Joseph Smith apart from his religious contemporaries. It makes him one of them. It places him squarely within the mainstream of revivalist Christianity, having the same kind of experience that Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians were having all around him. This creates an obvious problem for someone trying to establish a new religious movement with exclusive truth claims. If Joseph's vision was just another conversion experience, why should anyone follow him instead of joining the Methodists? If his encounter with the divine was the same as what thousands of others were experiencing, what made him special? The answer, it appears, required a different story. The 1838 account solves the problem that the 1832 account creates. By adding God the Father as a separate being, by including the condemnation of all existing churches, by transforming a personal conversion into a prophetic commission, Joseph Smith differentiated his experience from the common revival visions of his time. The later version is not just more detailed. It is theologically reconstructed to serve a purpose that the original experience, as he first described it, could not serve. This is why the cultural context of the Burned-Over District matters so much. It shows us that Joseph Smith's original account of his vision was not remarkable. It was typical. It was only later, as the institutional needs of his movement required something more distinctive, that the story evolved into the unprecedented theophany that Mormonism now teaches. The 1835 account. The story begins to grow. 3 years after writing his personal history, Joseph Smith told the first vision story again. This time, the audience was a visitor named Robert Matthews, who called himself Joshua the Jewish minister. The account was recorded in Joseph Smith's journal by his scribe. In this version, something interesting happens. The story starts to expand. Now Joseph describes seeing two personages. This is the first time in the historical record that he mentions more than one being appearing in the grove. However, the account is not entirely clear about who these beings are. Joseph does not explicitly identify them as God the Father and Jesus Christ. The description is vague, almost deliberately ambiguous. But the 1835 account adds another element that complicates the narrative even further. Joseph mentions seeing many angels during the vision. This detail appears nowhere else in any other account. It is never repeated in the official version. Angels simply appear in 1835 and then vanish from the story entirely. The sequence of events also changes. The order in which things happen, what Joseph experiences first, what he sees next, how the vision concludes, all of these details shift in ways that are difficult to reconcile with the other accounts. What is happening here? Why is the story evolving? One possibility is that Joseph Smith was simply remembering more details over time. Perhaps the 1832 account was abbreviated, and now he was filling in elements he had previously omitted. This is the explanation that the LDS Church typically offers. But this explanation raises serious questions. The addition of details is not random. The story grows in ways that serve specific purposes. In 1832, when the church was small and Joseph's authority was less established, the vision was personal and limited. By 1835, as the church grew and Joseph's claims to authority expanded, the vision began to include more dramatic elements. The pattern suggests that the first vision narrative was not being remembered more accurately over time. It was being developed. It was being shaped to meet the theological and institutional needs of an evolving religious movement. This is a critical point. Religious experiences, especially transformative ones, do not typically become more detailed and more dramatic with each retelling over many years. Human memory works in the opposite direction. Details fade. Specifics become general. What we remember clearly immediately after an event becomes hazier as time passes. Joseph Smith's first vision accounts follow the opposite trajectory. The story gets bigger, more detailed, more theologically significant with each passing year. The being becomes beings. The personal forgiveness becomes a cosmic commission. The simple answer to prayer becomes the inauguration of a new religious dispensation. This is not how memory works, but it is exactly how legend works. The 1838 account. The official version emerges. In 1838, Joseph Smith began dictating what would become the official history of the church. This version of the first vision is the one that members know today. It is canonized in the Pearl of Great Price, one of the standard works of LDS Scripture. It is taught to every investigator before baptism. It is the story told in general conference, in missionary discussions, in Sunday school classes around the world. And it is dramatically different from what Joseph wrote 6 years earlier. In the 1838 account, Joseph describes seeing two personages who are explicitly identified as God the Father and Jesus Christ. The Father appears first, points to the Son, and introduces him by name. This scene establishes the foundational LDS doctrine that the Father and the Son are two separate beings with distinct physical bodies, a direct rejection of traditional Christian Trinitarianism. The message of the vision has also transformed completely. Where the 1832 account focused on personal forgiveness, the 1838 account is about institutional condemnation. Joseph asks which church he should join. The answer he receives is devastating in its implications. Join none of them, for they are all wrong. All their creeds are an abomination. All their professors are corrupt. The entire Christian world has fallen into apostasy, and Joseph has been chosen to be the instrument of its restoration. This is not a personal conversion experience. This is a prophetic commissioning. This is the foundation for exclusive truth claims, for priesthood authority, for temple ordinances that cannot be performed anywhere else on earth. This version of the first vision creates an unbridgeable chasm between Mormonism and every other form of Christianity. The timing of this account is significant. By 1838, the LDS Church had experienced tremendous growth but also tremendous turmoil. There had been excommunications of high-ranking leaders, internal disputes about authority, financial scandals, and conflicts with non-Mormon neighbors that were escalating toward violence. Joseph Smith's authority was being challenged from multiple directions. Former allies had turned against him. New converts needed a compelling narrative that would bind them to the movement despite these difficulties. The first vision story, in its newly expanded form, provided exactly what was needed. The appearance of God the Father himself, not just Jesus, but the Father, elevated Joseph's prophetic status to the highest possible level. The condemnation of all other churches eliminated the possibility of compromise or accommodation with other religious groups. The explicit commission to restore the true gospel created an institutional mission that transcended any individual failing or scandal. In other words, the 1838 First Vision account appears at the precise moment when Joseph Smith needed it most. It resolves his authority problems by grounding his prophetic call in the most dramatic possible theophany. It resolves the Church's identity problems by defining Mormonism against every other religion. It provides a foundational narrative that can absorb and explain away any subsequent difficulty. Critics would say this is exactly what we would expect if the story were being constructed to meet institutional needs rather than remembered from authentic experience. Defenders would say that Joseph Smith simply felt impressed to share more complete details at a time when the Church was mature enough to receive them. But either way, we are confronted with an uncomfortable fact. The version of the first vision that the LDS Church treats as historically accurate and doctrinally authoritative did not exist until 18 years after the event supposedly occurred. For nearly 2 decades, Joseph Smith apparently never told anyone that God the Father had appeared to him, that all churches were condemned, or that he had been chosen to restore the true gospel to the earth. If this vision was the defining moment of Joseph's life, the experience that set everything else in motion, why did it take 18 years to tell the full story? The deafening silence. Where are the witnesses? Here's a question that should trouble anyone examining the first vision claims. If God the Father and Jesus Christ appeared to Joseph Smith in 1820, why did nobody know about it? Think about this carefully. According to the official narrative, a 14-year-old boy had the most remarkable religious experience in human history since the time of Christ. God himself, the creator of the universe, appeared in physical form along with his son. They spoke directly to this boy. They revealed that the entire Christian world was in apostasy. They chose him for a world-changing mission. And then apparently nobody mentioned it for over a decade. Consider who should have known about this vision and when they should have mentioned it. Joseph's own family, the Smiths, were religiously active and deeply interested in spiritual experiences. Lucy Mack Smith, Joseph's mother, later wrote a detailed biographical history of her son. She described his early visions of Moroni and the golden plates in extensive detail. But the first vision, the appearance of God the Father and Jesus Christ, is conspicuously absent from her early accounts. How does a mother forget to mention that her son saw God? The early converts to Mormonism also seem strangely unaware of the first vision. When the church was organized in 1830, when the Book of Mormon was published, when the first missionaries went out to preach, they did not lead with the story of God appearing to Joseph Smith. The early missionary message focused on the Book of Mormon and the restoration of priesthood authority. The first vision, which today is presented as the cornerstone of the restoration, was simply not part of the original message. The Book of Commandments, published in 1833, contains early revelations given through Joseph Smith. It includes his call as a prophet and descriptions of his divine authority. But there is no mention of the first vision. No reference to seeing God the Father. No account of being told that all churches were wrong. The foundational event of Mormonism is entirely absent from this foundational text. Perhaps most telling is the silence of Joseph Smith's critics. Throughout the 1820s and early 1830s, Joseph Smith faced intense opposition. Newspaper editors attacked him. Ministers denounced him. Former associates published exposés of his activities. These critics were eager to document anything that would discredit him or make him look foolish. They accused him of treasure digging and folk magic. They mocked the Book of Mormon. They questioned his character and his motives. They published every embarrassing detail they could find. But none of them, not one, mentioned that Joseph Smith claimed to have seen God the Father and Jesus Christ in 1820. This silence is inexplicable if the first vision story was being told. Anti-Mormon writers would have seized on such a claim with glee. A teenager claiming to have seen God the Father in bodily form would have been the perfect target for ridicule. The claim would have been denounced as blasphemous, as delusional, as proof of Joseph's mental instability or his willingness to tell outrageous lies. But the critics said nothing about it, because apparently there was nothing to say. The story, as we know it today, did not yet exist. The earliest anti-Mormon publication that mentions anything like the first vision appears in 1843, well after Joseph Smith had begun telling the 1838 version. By then, the story had been publicly circulated and critics could respond to it. But in the 1820s and early 1830s, when the vision supposedly occurred and when it supposedly shaped everything Joseph did, there is only silence. This pattern of silence extends across the board. No diary entries from family members describing the vision. No letters from early converts referencing it. No contemporary newspaper accounts reporting that Joseph Smith claimed a divine visitation. No court records where the claim might have come up during Joseph's legal troubles. Nothing. The first vision, as taught by the LDS Church today, appears to have left no trace in the historical record until Joseph Smith began writing about it himself in 1832. And even then, as we have seen, the story he told was dramatically different from the official version that would emerge later. Defenders of the faith often argue that Joseph Smith was persecuted for telling people about the vision, so he learned to keep quiet about it. The 1838 account itself claims that young Joseph faced opposition when he shared his experience with a local minister. But this explanation creates more problems than it solves. If Joseph told people and faced persecution, where is the evidence of that persecution? Where are the records of ministers denouncing his claims? Where are the newspaper articles mocking his vision? The historical record shows persecution for many things: treasure digging, the Book of Mormon, polygamy, political activities, but not for claiming to have seen God in 1820. The silence speaks louder than any defense can explain. For over a decade, the most important event in Joseph Smith's life apparently made no impression on anyone, including Joseph himself, until the institutional needs of his growing church required a more impressive origin story. The 1842 account. The marketing version. 4 years after the official account was written, Joseph Smith produced yet another version of the first vision. This time, the context was public relations. The account appeared in a letter to John Wentworth, a Chicago newspaper editor who had requested information about the Mormons. It was designed for publication, for distribution to people who knew nothing about the church and needed to be persuaded. The 1842 account is notable for what it leaves out. The language is polished, professional, and carefully non-threatening. The more controversial elements of the 1838 account are softened or omitted. There is less emphasis on the condemnation of other churches, less apocalyptic language, less that would alienate potential sympathizers or inflame opponents. This is the first vision as marketing material. It tells enough of the story to establish Joseph Smith's credentials as a prophet with divine authority, but it avoids the harder edges that might provoke rejection. It is designed to open doors, not close them. The existence of this version raises its own questions. If Joseph Smith was simply reporting what happened to him, why would the account change based on the intended audience? A historical event either happened or it did not. The details do not change depending on whether the listener is friendly or hostile. But if Joseph Smith was constructing a narrative for strategic purposes, then of course the presentation would shift based on context. A story designed to solidify the loyalty of existing members would emphasize different elements than a story designed to recruit new converts. A story for internal consumption might include claims that would be too provocative for external distribution. By 1842, the first vision had become a tool. It was no longer simply Joseph Smith's personal experience. It was an institutional asset to be deployed strategically in service of the church's growth and survival. The critical comparison: what actually changed? Let us be very clear about what we are comparing. These 4 accounts do not differ in minor peripheral details. They differ in the most fundamental elements of the experience. How many beings appeared? In 1832, Joseph saw one being, identified as the Lord. In 1835, he saw 2 personages plus many angels. In 1838 and 1842, he saw 2 personages without angels. The number of divine beings in a theophany is not a trivial detail. It is the central element of the experience. Who appeared? In 1832, Joseph saw the Lord without distinguishing between Father and Son. In 1835, the identities remain ambiguous. In 1838, God the Father and Jesus Christ appear as clearly separate beings, with the Father introducing the Son. This is not a minor clarification. This is a fundamental shift in the theological content of the vision. Why did they appear? In 1832, the vision was about personal forgiveness of sins. By 1838, it was about cosmic restoration, the condemnation of all Christianity, and the prophetic commissioning of Joseph Smith. These are completely different purposes for a divine visitation. What message was delivered? In 1832, Joseph learned that his sins were forgiven and that Jesus died for the world. In 1838, he learned that all churches were abominations, all creeds were wrong, and he must not join any of them. These messages are not different emphases of the same revelation. They are different revelations entirely. Defenders of the LDS Church often argue that these variations are no different from the way anyone might tell the same story differently at different times. They point out that witnesses in courtrooms sometimes give varying accounts of the same event. They suggest that Joseph Smith simply emphasized different aspects of his experience depending on his purpose and audience. But this comparison does not hold up under examination. It is true that human memory is imperfect. People do forget details or emphasize different aspects of experiences when retelling them. But there are limits to this variability. No one forgets whether they saw one person or two in the most important experience of their life. No one accidentally adds a second being to a vision years after the fact. No one changes the fundamental purpose of a divine revelation from personal forgiveness to cosmic restoration. When we see a story that grows dramatically over time, that adds major new elements years after the supposed event, that changes its fundamental character to meet evolving institutional needs, we are not seeing memory. We are seeing development. We are seeing construction. We are seeing a narrative being shaped for purposes beyond simple historical reporting. The LDS Church has developed several responses to the problems posed by the multiple first vision accounts. It is worth examining these responses carefully, because they represent the best arguments that intelligent believers have been able to construct. The first response is that people naturally tell the same story differently at different times. This is true up to a point. But as we have seen, the variations in the first vision accounts go far beyond what we would expect from normal memory fluctuation. The changes are too large, too systematic, and too conveniently aligned with Joseph Smith's evolving institutional needs. The second response is that Joseph Smith was emphasizing different aspects of his experience for different audiences. This explanation has some plausibility for the 1842 account, which was written for external publication. But it does not explain why the 1832 account, which was Joseph's personal journal, would omit the most dramatic and important elements of the vision. When writing for yourself, there is no reason to leave out the most significant details. The third response is that Joseph Smith was commanded not to reveal certain aspects of the vision until later. This is an unfalsifiable claim that can be used to explain away any inconvenient evidence. It also raises the question of why God would want the founding narrative of his restored church to be incomplete and misleading for its first 2 decades. The fourth response is that the 1832 account was not meant to be a complete description of the vision. But this does not explain why Joseph explicitly states that he saw one being when he supposedly saw 2. An incomplete account might omit details, but it would not contradict them. There is a deeper problem with all of these defenses. They require us to assume that Joseph Smith was a prophet telling the truth, and then to construct explanations that preserve that assumption. But the historical method works in the opposite direction. We examine the evidence and let it lead us to conclusions, rather than starting with conclusions and working backward to explain away problematic evidence. When we apply the same standards of evidence to Joseph Smith that we would apply to any other historical figure making extraordinary claims, the first vision accounts become deeply problematic. The pattern of development, the convenient timing of new details, the alignment with institutional needs, the suppression of earlier versions, all of these factors point in a direction that faithful members find uncomfortable. It is also worth noting that biblical prophets did not revise their revelations over time. When Isaiah or Jeremiah or Paul described their divine encounters, they told consistent stories. They did not add new beings or change the message decades later. The prophetic tradition that Joseph Smith claimed to restore does not support the kind of narrative development we see in the first vision accounts. We have examined the historical evidence. We have traced the development of the first vision narrative from 1832 to 1842. We have considered the explanations offered by the LDS Church and found them wanting. Now we must face the implications. If God revealed absolute truth to Joseph Smith in the spring of 1820, why did that truth need to be adjusted as the Church grew? Why did the number of divine beings change? Why did the message transform from personal forgiveness to cosmic restoration? Why was the earliest account hidden for decades? These are not questions that critics invented to attack the Church. These are questions that arise naturally from examining the Church's own historical documents. The LDS Church produced these accounts. It preserved them in its archives. It published them, eventually, when researchers discovered their existence and began asking uncomfortable questions. The question is not whether the accounts differ. The Church itself now acknowledges that they differ. The question is what those differences mean. For believers, the differences represent the normal variation in human memory, amplified by the difficulty of describing ineffable spiritual experiences. The core truth remains intact across all accounts, even if the details vary. For critics, the differences represent the evolution of a religious narrative that was constructed over time to meet the needs of a growing institution. The changes are too large and too convenient to be explained by memory alone. Each person must weigh the evidence and reach their own conclusion. But that weighing must be done with full access to all the relevant information. For too long, the LDS Church presented only the 1838 account as though it were the complete and authoritative record of what happened. Members were not told about the earlier versions. They were not given the opportunity to evaluate the evidence for themselves. If the first vision is unstable, what happens to the rest of the Mormon foundational narrative? The Book of Mormon depends on Joseph Smith's prophetic authority. The priesthood restoration depends on his claim to divine commission. The temple ordinances depend on his role as a revelator of sacred truths. Everything traces back to that grove in 1820. A building is only as strong as its foundation. If the foundation is cracked, the entire structure becomes unstable. The first vision is the foundation of Mormonism, and the cracks in that foundation are visible to anyone willing to examine the historical record. This documentary has presented evidence and raised questions. It has not demanded that viewers reach any particular conclusion. That is not the purpose of honest investigation. The purpose is to ensure that people have access to information that was, for too long, hidden or minimized. The purpose is to create space for genuine inquiry rather than predetermined conclusions. The purpose is to respect the intelligence and autonomy of people who deserve to make informed decisions about their spiritual lives. If the LDS Church's truth claims are valid, they should be able to withstand scrutiny. If the first vision happened as the 1838 account describes, then the existence of earlier, different accounts should have a satisfying explanation. If Joseph Smith was a true prophet, then the evidence should ultimately support that conclusion when examined fairly. But if the truth claims cannot withstand scrutiny, if the explanations for the discrepancies are unconvincing, if the evidence points in a direction that challenges the official narrative, then people deserve to know that too. Faith that fears investigation is not faith. It is fear. And fear is not a foundation for spiritual life. True faith, the kind that can sustain a life, must be grounded in honesty. It must be willing to face uncomfortable questions. It must be confident enough to examine evidence without fear of what might be found. The truth does not need to be protected from investigation. The truth does not require multiple versions. The truth does not hide earlier accounts that might prove inconvenient. The truth simply is what it is, unchanging and unafraid of examination. Joseph Smith claimed to have received the truth directly from God. We have examined the record of that claim. The evidence is now before you. What you conclude is your decision. But whatever you decide, let it be based on the full picture, not the carefully edited version that was presented for nearly 2 centuries. Let it be the product of honest inquiry, not institutional loyalty. Let it be your conclusion, reached through your own examination of the evidence. That is all any of us can ask of each other. And it is more than many religious institutions are willing to offer. Thank you for watching. If this content has been valuable, please share it with others who might benefit from examining these questions. The conversation continues. And the truth, whatever it is, deserves to be pursued.